And all across this great nation, we come together for this special service. From our teeming cities to the smallest hamlets, from New York City to Los Angeles, California, and from Winslow, Arizona, to small towns like this, Alexander, North Dakota. From every corner of this great and good land, people are gathering together. And in the city of Philadelphia today, the Liberty Bell is ringing. Whether we are Republican or Democrat, young or old, rich or poor, infirm or strong, whether we are Christian or Jew, Buddhist or Muslim, believer or non-believer, we are gathered together today. We gather in churches, in auditoriums, in public parks, and of course, in cemeteries on this special day. And we may be black or white or Indian or Asian or Hispanic or a combination of these and many others. It really doesn't matter, for we are all Americans. And when you stop and think about it, it's really quite unreal. No matter how diverse we are, no matter what our differences may be or where we come from, we all share this common bond. We are Americans, and we come together today for one special purpose, one common purpose, to honor those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, to honor those who have spent themselves in a cause greater than their own. Now, I am well aware that in this cynical world we live in today, there are many of the so-called intelligentsia, the enlightened ones, the Bill Maher's of this world, who say that patriotism really isn't in style anymore and that these observances are really quite mundane and they are a bit like preaching to the choir. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the problem is that a large part of the choir has forgotten the melody, and on occasion they need to be reminded of what it means to be an American. There are countless numbers of men and women who have distinguished themselves in our nation's wars. In 1992, I was fortunate enough to get to know one of these heroes personally. His name was Joe Foss. Joe was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Franklin Roosevelt for his actions in the defense of Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, 1942. Joe was a living piece of American history, and he represented the best of America, both in war and also in peacetime. A little history. Joe was born on a small farm just outside of Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 1915. When he was 12 years old, Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, had just completed his transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. And shortly thereafter, Lindbergh flew his Spirit of St. Louis on a barnstorming tour through the Midwest. And Joe told me about seeing the silver airplane gradually appearing on the horizon, touching down on a little grass strip just outside of Sioux Falls. And as Lindy got out of the airplane, he was mobbed by the crowd, and as he walked to the speaker's stand, people gathered all around him. Joe told me, he said, I pushed my way through the crowd to get close to Lindy when a couple of soldiers grabbed me by the nape of the neck and took me to the back of the crowd. I noticed that no one was around Lindy's airplane. I walked around the plane several times, running my hand along the fuselage, and I said to myself, one day I'm going to be bigger than Charles Lindbergh. And he was. In 1940, Joe joined the Marine Corps, and in 1942 he graduated from Pensacola Naval Air Station and was promptly sent to Guadalcanal in the Solomons. This was just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Guadalcanal was held by the Japanese and was being used as a base of operations against Australia and other areas of the Pacific. The Japanese held the majority of the island, but the Marines were able to capture a portion of it, and they held the important Henderson Field. In his very first aerial combat, Joe was engaged in a dogfight with a group of Japanese Zeros directly over Henderson Field. His airplane got all shot up, and without his engine, he was able to limp his fighter back into the strip for a dead stick landing, and was immediately surrounded by a group of cheering Marines who had just witnessed the air battle directly overhead. When he examined his airplane, he found more than 200 bullet holes in it. He didn't say, but I'm sure then he wondered why the heck he had ever left the farm in South Dakota. During his time in the Solomons, Joe shot down 26 Japanese aircraft. Joe himself was shot down 4 times and was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His men would say of him, "That Joe Foss had all the balls of any man who ever walked the earth." Joe went on to be the governor of South Dakota, the president of the National Rifle Association. He started the American Football League, became its first commissioner. Joe was indeed a walking piece of American history. I once asked Joe, I said, "How do you explain your luck? You shot down 4 times and survived." He said, "Luck had nothing to do with it. The Lord had bigger plans for me." And indeed, he did. He and his wife, Dee Dee, spent the last 20 years of their lives working around the country with various church groups, Youth for Christ, and several others. In 1952, Joe was approached by a Hollywood producer who wanted to do a movie on his war exploits while defending Guadalcanal. Joe met with the producer, and none other than John Wayne, who was to play the role of Joe in the movie. While going over the script with John Wayne and the producer, Joe noticed a portion which portrayed himself as having a liaison with a Navy nurse. Joe was not very happy. He said, "That never happened. You guys got to take that out of there." And the producer explained that they needed a little romance to make things more interesting and offered Joe $1 million to endorse the script. Joe replied, "There is nothing romantic about war. It was either kill or be killed. We were only trying to survive." And indeed, before the fighting was over, Joe had lost over half his squadron. The point of this story is that Joe's wartime actions were not about Joe himself. It was about his service to country and to his fellow soldiers. And such was the character of Joe Foss, and such was the character of the rank and file fighting men who have led this country in 100 foreign lands and 1,000 battlefields. Joe Foss was the most honorable and charismatic character I have ever met, and what an honor for me to have been in his presence. One afternoon, he asked me if I had ever been to Pearl Harbor, and I said yes. I had taken my family there not long ago, and I found it profoundly moving. He then asked, "Have you been to Normandy?" And I said, "No, but I would like to go someday." He then turned to me and said, "You really must go to Normandy." And so I did. A few years ago, on a return trip from Africa, I stopped in France to visit Normandy. Landing in Paris, I played the typical tourist role: the Eiffel Tower, Palace of Versailles, Arc de Triomphe, etc., etc. When riding in a cab back to my hotel one evening, my cab driver, who looked to me to be in his 40s, asked me why I had come to France and what I had seen. I told him I was ready to leave Paris for Normandy. "Normandy," he said. "Why would you go to Normandy? It's cold up there." I said I wanted to visit the invasion beaches where we, along with the British and Canadians and Free French, liberated his country from Nazi tyranny. He couldn't understand why I would leave Paris and travel to Normandy, and worse yet, He had no idea what had happened at Normandy a generation before. And I was absolutely astonished. I was tempted to tell him that if it were not for the Americans who stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944, that he would likely be doing the goose step and drinking Rhine wine rather than this fine French Chablis. But I kept silent. He wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. And the truth is, the French never really liked us much. We bailed them out of 2 world wars, and they still don't like us. And they certainly don't teach their young people about the U.S. contribution to their salvation in 2 world wars. Shortly after the liberation of Paris from the Nazis, Charles de Gaulle announced to the world that he wanted all American troops out of France as soon as possible. To which General Eisenhower replied, "Does that include the 10,000 American dead buried at Normandy?" And so I took Joe's advice. I went to Normandy. I walked along Omaha Beach. I visited the 172-acre cemetery, the only lands we held after World War II, paid for in the blood of our 10,000 soldiers. A particularly moving part of the memorial was the mass grave of the 1,557 men who were unable to be identified because of the ravages of war. They were buried in a common grave, and it struck me that their burial here was a silent metaphor for what America was really all about. 1,000+ men of all ancestries and backgrounds who came not as conquerors, but as liberators, who were cut down in the flower of their youth with all the joys of life before them. And I stood and looked out over the cliffs of a place known as Pointe du Hoc, just off Omaha Beach, where some 200 Army Rangers scaled the steep cliffs to knock out several batteries of German artillery aimed to wreak havoc on our ships in the English Channel. I saw where the Rangers climbed the ropes up the steep cliffs as German machine gunners were shooting down at them. When some men would fall, others grabbed the ropes and continued up the 100-foot cliffs until the men secured the foothold and captured the German artillery. Of the 200 Army Rangers at Pointe du Hoc that day, less than 100 survived, but they achieved their objective. The world really does not much remember that, but it's important that they be reminded. Not long ago, our president visited France. He didn't visit Normandy. He was on his apology tour, and his focus was not on our contributions, but on our mistakes, things we had done wrong. And it's really too bad that he wasn't at Normandy. Odd that he couldn't take a few moments to talk about our sacrifice to the betterment of the world instead of making apologies for our past actions. Being from North Dakota and the deep affection we all have for Theodore Roosevelt, I must take the liberty to talk to you a bit about him and his 4 sons. Now, we all know about TR's actions with the Rough Riders and his charge up San Juan Hill and the like in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, but it's time to learn a bit about his 4 sons and their unending dedication to country. TR had 4 boys: Quentin, his firstborn, and then TR number 2, followed by Archie, and then Kermit. Quentin, his undisputable favorite, was shot down and killed in France in aerial combat in 1918, World War I. When Quentin died, it broke TR's heart. He was devastated. Quentin was indeed his favorite, and he felt personally responsible for Quentin's death, as he had indeed encouraged Quentin to get to the front and, as TR would say, into the thick of things. Shortly after TR got the cable at his home at Sagamore Hill announcing the death of his beloved Quentin, he wrote, "It's a sad thing to know that I was in some way responsible for Quentin's death, but I do not regret it." and I would do it again. Soon after the bad news came, the Germans took photos of the dead and mangled body of Quentin in the wreckage of his airplane and sent them to TR's home at Sagamore Hill to further his grief. It had just the opposite effect. TR put them on display, made copies, and sent them to family and friends, for they were cherished mementos of Quentin's gallant ending, giving his life for his beloved country. But Quentin's death really haunted him. TR died a broken man just a year later. Shortly before he died in 1919, the sickly old lion wrote the following: "Honor, highest honor, to those who fearlessly face death for a good cause. No life is so honorable or so fruitful that it cannot be sacrificed for a great cause. Unless men are willing to die for great ideals and love of country, ideals will vanish, and the world will become one huge sty of materialism." TR Jr., Roosevelt's second-born son, was severely wounded in World War I and was a victim of a crippling gas attack. At the time of World War II, during the Normandy invasion, TR Jr., although severely disabled from World War I, he was walking with a cane at the time. He insisted that he be in the initial assault on Utah Beach. He had a heart condition, and he knew it, and he would not let his doctors examine him. His doctors told him that he would never survive the landing. But being one of the very first to land, he rallied the troops to get off the beach and up to the protection of the higher ground at the shoreline. He constantly went back and forth from the landing crafts to the bluffs, exposing himself to enemy fire again and again and again, rallying the men to get off the beach. He hollered that the only men still on this beach are the dead and those that will be. Of his actions that day, General Omar Bradley testified that it was the most remarkable exhibition of bravery he had seen in his 40 years of military service. TR Jr. died just 2 weeks later of a heart attack and was awarded the Medal of Honor and is buried alongside his younger brother Quentin with nearly 10,000 others in the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. The third son of TR, Archie, was also severely wounded in World War I. During a German artillery bombardment in France, he suffered a shattered kneecap and a fractured arm, for which he received a full military disability. He was in the reserves after World War I and volunteered for service at the outbreak of World War II. Archie was denied active duty because of his medical condition, and only when he appealed to President Franklin Roosevelt was he able to serve. He told FDR that he had to get into the war and up to the front. While in combat in New Guinea, he was again wounded in the same knee, and he remains today to be the only man to win a 100% disability from 2 world wars. TR's last-born son, Kermit, served in World War I in North Africa and again in World War II against the Japanese in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. All of TR's sons volunteered to serve in combat. Not to be outdone, TR's daughter, Ethel, went to France in World War I and volunteered as a nurse. She was actually the first of the family to arrive in France. 3 of TR's sons, Quentin, TR Jr., and Kermit, died in uniform. I thought you ought to know about that. So, leaving our heroes of the past for the moment, what about today? Where do we get these young men and women to fight old men's wars? We know we live in a most precarious world, perhaps not much safer today than in the dangerous days of the Soviet Union, and we know that war will always be with us. As the philosopher Plato said over 2,000 years ago, only the dead have seen the last of war. We know that sooner or later another evil will rear its ugly head, whether it be Iran, North Korea, or the horde of Islamic fundamentalists who wish to impose their sick, distorted Sharia law on all freedom-loving peoples around the world. A while ago, I had the occasion to make a presentation at a Marine Corps officer commissioning in Southern California. I was a guest of a lifelong friend of mine whose son was being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. The young Marine, whose name is Neil Langston, graduated at the top of his class among a group of 300 cadets. He is the embodiment of the countless thousands of dedicated men and women who have honored the Marine Corps and their country with their dedication of service. Neil graduated near the top of his class, and he no doubt could make a great deal more money in the private sector. But he chose to dedicate 10 years, and perhaps more, indeed, perhaps even his very life itself, in service to country. And I was watching the swearing-in ceremony. I kept thinking, where do we get these young men? Where do we get these men like Joe Foss, the Roosevelt children, and this young Marine, Neil Langston? These men who carry the nation's burden. These young men and women who hold our destiny in their hands. In the words of Ronald Reagan, freedom is only one generation away from extinction. We don't pass it on to our children with our bloodstream. It must be protected and handed down to them. And it is so true. We are only one generation away from tyranny, and so it behooves us to make some sort of contribution. As we honor our service people today, we need to ask ourselves, what can we do? Well, we can, all of us. We can make a small but significant contribution. We can start by teaching our children. Schools aren't teaching much history anymore. Most kids couldn't name 10 presidents, but they could tell you the names of the last few winners of the American Idol contest, or what the Hollywood celebrities are up to. And it's really not their fault. It's our fault. It's ours. We need to take up this burden. We need to encourage them to stop texting and start reading. Try to help them get off all these all-consuming obsessions with trivialities. We need to teach them to stand tall with their hands over their hearts as the flag passes. We need to teach them to sing God Bless America and the Star-Spangled Banner, and sing it with them, and sing it loud, like nobody's listening. Teach them the joys of loving their country. You might take the family on a field trip to Washington, or visit the battlefield at Gettysburg, or the cemetery at Arlington, or perhaps walk the Freedom Trail at Boston. And if you are able, I know it's expensive, but if you are able, visit the cemetery of the 10,000 dead at Normandy. For here lie the real American idols. And don't ever allow anyone to demean the role of America in the world. Just try to imagine for a moment what the world would look like today were it not for our participation in World War II. And the truth is, the United States is today the main force of good in the world. We are the only ones able. We have the power. But as Theodore Roosevelt once said, good weapons are necessary, but if you put the finest weapons in the hands of a coward, he will be beaten by a brave man with a club. We do indeed have the power, but we must have the resolve. And we must continue to lead the world into what Winston Churchill called the broad, sunlit uplands. I want to again thank you for coming today, and as we depart, I want to leave you with a short message, a proverb, a Lakota Sioux proverb, spoken in their native tongue. It goes like this. Hekta O ia, kia, stampe, and ohiniaun, toyapeke toya. And it means we will all be known forever by the tracks we leave behind. And I have no doubt that all the fine men and women who have given themselves to our country will forever be known by the tracks they have left behind. God bless America.